Hi, Fernie. How are you?
Morning. We'll start exactly at 10.
Okay.
De La Salle University has existed for more than 100 years. It is cool to be part of this traditional yet global institution that embraces cultural diversity.
My professors have been so helpful and encouraging. They guide me to the right coursework and program. They continue to teach me to strive for academic excellence.
I'm comfortable with the facilities, particularly with the Learning Commons, as it offers a lot of rooms to study and research. Also, the assistance and support of library personnel are superb.
My exchange experience opened doors of opportunities I did not know I could have before. It was a very life-changing, unexpected journey, and it undoubtedly is the highlight of my college experience.
The program has helped me deal with people from different backgrounds and work ethics, and it is a learning experience that would forever leave a mark in me.
The Mindanao State University was officially created by law by virtue of Republic Act 1387 as amended. The principal author of this act was the late Senator Ahmed Tumukao A. Alonto Sr., the university founding father. MSU is the first state university in the southern part of the Philippines in Mindanao, and second to the University of the Philippines, being the first and premier state-sponsored institution of higher education in the country. MSU was formally established on September 1, 1961 in Marawi City, formerly called as Densalan, the capital city of the province of Lanao del Sur. Aspiring to be the center of excellence in instruction, research, and extension by transforming itself into a globally competitive national peace university, MSU System is committed to lead in social transformation through peace education and integration of Muslims and other cultural minority groups into the mainstream society, ensure excellence in instruction, research development, innovation, extension, and environmental education and discovery, advance national and international linkages through collaborations, and demonstrate greater excellence, relevance, and inclusiveness for Mindanao and the Filipino nation. From a one-campus university, the Mindanao State University transformed into an 11-campus university system with a total student population of 82,064 and a faculty force of 3,444 in 2015. Each campus is headed by a chancellor or superintendent for the 3 integrated technical vocational education campuses. Presently, MSU is the largest government university in the Philippines in terms of student population. The university president is the head of the whole MSU system and is concurrently the chief executive officer of MSU Marawi campus. The president also serves as the ex-officio vice chairman of the Board of Regents, the highest policy-making body of the university. The Office of the President caters all services to 11 campuses. It also oversees the excellence of academic and support plans, policies, and programs of the university and all of its component entities, leads the institution in acquiring resources for the development and implementation of initiatives, guides important governance precedents, collaborates with a wide range of internal and external stakeholders, supervises the relationship between students and administration, and executes personnel system. The Office of the President is located in the Administration Building of Marawi Campus. Over the years, MSU Marawi as the mother campus has transformed to an extremely modernized academic institution which holds aloft the desire to maintain quality education. At present, the university operation is complemented by the university's physical plant and facilities. These include the recently completed academic buildings that are equipped with contemporary classrooms, laboratories,
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second day of our international webinar on social research methods in the era of digital technology and sustainable development goals. So today is the second day, and this morning session is the fifth session. Let me just, and the title of this morning session, or first session, is Research Methods for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Our speaker is an associate professor and vice chair of the Department of Political Science of De La Salle University. She holds a PhD in gender studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, or the SOAS, of the University of London in the UK. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Christianne F. Collantes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to Dr. Santiago and to Search for inviting me to this webinar. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here. Again, I am Christianne Collantes. I actually go by Chris. And I am from, again, the Political Science Department, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about research methods on gender, sexuality, and women's studies. But to be honest, I think this webinar or this workshop is actually going to be more on methodology, and I'll explain later as to why that is. Before I continue, I just want to give an outline, a very brief outline as to what exactly I'll be discussing with you. So the first thing I'll look at is I want to talk a little bit about the differences between researching gender, sexuality, and women's experiences. So depending on the project that you're doing, these three things may overlap, but there is a way to do research on just gender and just sexuality and not necessarily doing all three things. And I'll, again, just discuss briefly what those differences may be. And then I'll also focus here on feminist research. So I'm not sure how many of you decide to do this kind of work, but I do want to go over this with you. And again, I'll talk about what makes research feminist, what are its guiding principles, and what are its objectives. Third, I'll talk about some of the ethical considerations that are important to feminist research as well. And then fourth, I'll discuss some of the dilemmas that may come up in the field. So some of the issues and concerns that may come up when you're actually conducting the research or conducting the studies. Things that may come up for you and that have definitely come up for me and that I've had to think about and be critical about in my own work. And I also want to keep this fairly brief because I think I'd rather, or not rather, but I'd also really want to engage with you and have a rich Q&A with you and have that dialogue. So what are the differences between researching gender, sexuality, and women's experiences? So if you are deciding to do projects just on gender or primarily at gender, give me 1 second. So if you are doing a project on gender, you may be simply identifying the differences between men and women. So here you would be mapping out and documenting men and women's positions in society. So an example of this is, let's say you're doing a project on perhaps men and women in the workforce. Perhaps you want to look at salary equality between men and women here. You could do projects as well on political participation or even voting. So perhaps you want to look at the differences between voting, between men and women, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other example here that I'm giving is also education. So perhaps you want to look at the education system and see why men are more present in certain fields, et cetera. Are women also present in the college system? Are they graduating at the same rate as men? So these are, again, just very simple examples at how you want to only look at gender and not necessarily sexuality, or have these projects be a feminist project. When we look at sexuality, so I want to be honest with you, I had a lot of problems putting these points together because sexuality research or sexuality studies is actually much more complex. But I'll try to just give some good examples here. So yes, sexuality studies can include researching attitudes about intimacy or sexual practices, sexual lives, et cetera. But also this research can also include research on the LGBTQ community, so the queer community. And here you would be talking exploring not just sexual orientation, so of course the gay, lesbian, bisexual communities. You would also be discussing gender identity, especially and specifically if you're discussing gender or transgender politics. So of course, gender here wouldn't just be about this binary between men and women. Now here you're analyzing gender as identity, as performance, as a social construct, right? So again, there's a lot to say here actually about gender and sexuality intersecting in this kind of research, especially when you're going to do this kind of work with transgender communities or transgender politics. And there are actually a lot more seasoned and more equipped scholars who do this kind of work. And I can even name our former colleague, Dr. Mikey Inton Campbell, who is an actual trans activist and does a lot of rich work on this scholarship. And then if you want to do projects that are really on women's experiences, especially if you're using feminist approaches. So this starts to differ from just doing work on gender itself. We're using gender as that analytic focal point, right? So here you're not just identifying the differences, you're now actually challenging the differences between men and women. So now you start to ask, why are women not getting paid the same as men in a certain corporation or a company? So you're trying to locate why they aren't present in certain fields in education, et cetera, et cetera. So you're really not just discussing or mapping out the differences, but you're now challenging and interrogating systems of patriarchy or sexism or misogyny, et cetera, et cetera. So that's more of the feminist project when you do work on women's experiences. And then the other thing here is you're also trying or aiming to highlight their narratives and experiences. And the reason for that is because a lot of feminist scholars have recognized and seen that perhaps their experiences haven't been accounted for in certain disciplines or other traditional discourses. So again, if you're doing a feminist project, you are also creating space for them and making them more visible in your scholarship. So I don't know if this is the best example. I don't know if it's the perfect example, but I kind of want to apply what I just talked about with this topic. So perhaps you're doing research on teenage pregnancies in the Philippines. And this is from CNN Philippines, and it's actually quite recent. It was posted just in February 2021. So if you're looking, for example, just at gender, you might be doing a project on, let's say, why less women are going to college in a certain area or region. And then we find out that teenage pregnancies are happening at quite a high rate in that specific area. So it does prevent them from going into college. So that's an example of a project that's looking just at gender and not necessarily on sexual behaviors or sexual lives. If you want to approach this instead and look at sexuality, You might look at teenage pregnancy and explore maybe the lack of sex education, or maybe you want to investigate teenage attitudes towards contraceptives or family planning, et cetera, et cetera. So that is another example of how you're only looking, or you're primarily looking at sexuality when trying to address teenage pregnancies. And then a more feminist project when approaching teenage pregnancies or the same topic is you would probably, again, highlight their experiences. So you would try to foreground the narratives of teenage mothers. And then you'd also ask bigger questions. So perhaps these teenage mothers are getting discriminated against in education or in the workforce, probably because of patriarchal norms that they're facing, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this is just an example of how you can use gender as a way to approach something. You can use sexuality. And also there are ways to do this from more of a feminist perspective, or using a feminist approach. So here I want to go over some of the feminist research guiding principles. And the reason for that is because there is no single definition of feminist research. It actually tends to be quite interdisciplinary. So for instance, there is feminist ethnography, feminist economics, history, it's in the humanities and other social sciences, etc. Another example I can think of is feminist psychology. So it isn't just one rigid way of doing research design and saying that this is feminist. Usually it is incorporated with other disciplines. But I want to go over some of the objectives of feminist research if you're deciding to do this kind of work. So the first thing I want to bring up is feminist research or scholarship is concerned with producing new knowledge and also social change. So there is this component of advocacy behind feminist scholarship. It aims to empower women and also subvert gender inequality. So it's not just about extracting this information and putting it out there. You're trying to actually create and produce this information with the hopes of creating new knowledge that can impact social change. And then the second point here is that feminist research tends to, or it seeks to remove the power imbalance between researcher and subject. And usually in some of the social sciences, or when we think about research, we often think of ourselves as the researcher as having some sort of authority, and then we have our subjects. But in feminist scholarship or in feminist methodology or methods, we actually don't think of our respondents just as subjects, but rather they are equal to us or more equal to us. And they also become sort of co-producers of this knowledge, right? So it's very collaborative work. So again, we try to do that again by eliminating some of the power imbalances that may be present in the scholarship or in the research. And then another point here is intersectional analysis. So, you know, I'm talking a lot about gender and sexuality and women's experiences, but really what we're trying to do as well is doing intersectional work. So I'm not sure how many of you have encountered this term yet, but intersectionality really is about looking at more layers of oppression. So this term came from Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a feminist scholar, and she coined it in 1989. And she was saying that women don't just experience sexism. You know, it depends on their actual identities and the different categories or layers that form their experiences, right? So she's talking about the importance of race, the importance of class. And she was actually talking more about, at this particular moment, talking about Black women's experiences. So they're not just dealing with patriarchy or sexism, patriarchy or sexism or even misogyny. Sometimes their primary struggle is actually racism, right? So here we try to not just talk about gender and other types of systems that only oppress that gendered experience, but we're also looking at race, we're looking at class. We're looking at if you're an ethnic minority, a religious minority, disability, et cetera, et cetera. So again, all these things can combine and intersect to shape or impact an individual or community's specific experiences. And then the other thing I want to actually add here that I didn't yet include in this particular slide is the importance of agency, right? So when you are doing feminist research, you don't, or we don't want to view or write about women as just victims, right? We also want to think of them as agents of their own circumstances. So an example of this would be research on, let's say, sex work, right? So of course, you can identify that sex work can be exploitative and oppressive to certain women, especially women who fall into this or are trapped by this kind of labor. But on the other hand, there is also feminist scholarship that looks at sex work and looks at women who willingly participate in this kind of labor, right? So, they find value and dignity in their work. They want to regulate the sex work industry. They want to advocate for other sex workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So here, that's an example of looking at women as more complex individuals. We're never trying to portray them or depict women or even members of the queer community as just victims. We always want to find space and give opportunity to show them as also empowered individuals as well. So I want to talk about some of the ethical considerations when it comes to feminist research. And ethics are always important. It's actually just part of the research procedure, right? It's part of the process. We undergo ethics clearances and whatnot, especially when we do work with human subjects. But for feminist scholars or feminist researchers, so anytime you're doing work again with marginalized communities or doing a sensitive topic with women, you're not just looking, or as researchers, we're not just looking at the power dynamics that shape their lives, but we have to also acknowledge where we come from, and we usually come from really privileged positions, right? So a lot of researchers will come from really reputable universities, they get funding, they go off and do the work, and they're coming from that place of advantage or benefit. And this is something we have to acknowledge. And we also want to be careful in terms of not reproducing this kind of power dynamic or power imbalance when we create our research. So for feminist researchers, conducting the research, doing the actual analysis, and producing this knowledge requires this constant dismantling of power imbalances and dynamics. And the way to do this, some of the ways to do this, and I think Dr. Cabañas mentioned that I would probably talk about this in my talk, and he was right. So I want to bring up the importance of positionality and also reflexivity. And I don't want to be too dense or too theoretical with these two terms. I'll try to give you an example, but positionality and reflexivity is commonly used in feminist research or queer theory or advocacy research. And the simple or short way to put it is you're trying to identify your own position of power as a researcher, right? So for instance, I'll give you my own personal example. I did work in the Philippines while I was still a PhD student. I did work on reproductive politics and reproductive experiences here in the Philippines. And that was around the time that the RH law had just passed. So coming into this field was really, it's something I had to grapple with because I was talking to a lot of women who couldn't access certain family planning options because of their conditions or because of their circumstances. They were fighting for reproductive rights in many cases. And then, simultaneously, I'm coming from a Western context. I'm working with a big Western university. And not only that, I was also coming from a country where family planning options are more readily available to us. So we have more reproductive rights. I'm originally from Canada, actually, if you cannot tell already. So this is something I had to, again, grapple with in my own work. And so here's where I had to really think about my own positionality in the larger situation of my research. And the way feminist scholars do this is they engage in the act or practice of reflexivity. So that's the second term that I use here. And what that means is, again, you're critically reflecting on your own positionality and including that in your actual work, right? So if you engage with different types of feminist scholarship or feminist works, you will see that usually in the methodology section, the researcher, the scholar will actually discuss your positionality, and they'll do that by being reflexive. They'll do that practice of reflexivity in that section. So that's quite important. And again, this is a way to be transparent and to acknowledge also where we fit and where we are situated in within that larger context of being part of the research organization, et cetera, et cetera. So I know these are two quite, they're quite heavy terms, and I think we can talk more about that later on in the Q&A section. So this is my last slide, because again, I want to keep this fairly brief to have more of a dialogue with you later on, but I also want to discuss some of the dilemmas that may come up in the field. When I say field here, I am sort of referring to this pre-pandemic context or situation, but I understand that now, especially since the pandemic and because of lockdown, we're actually now doing a lot of our work online. So you can actually pair a lot of what I'm saying here to, let's say, Dr. Cabañas's work from yesterday when he discussed his digital ethnography and digital work. So field may be, of course, a physical space, but in the contemporary times, I think it can also mean digital spaces as well. So the first thing that usually comes up is there's a concern around space and context. So what I mean by that is you want to be really conscious and aware in terms of what kind of space that you're allowing for these interviews or these dialogues to happen with your respondents, right? So especially if you're doing really sensitive topics. So if you are perhaps interested in doing work on women who have experienced sexual or domestic violence, then you want to find ways to create safe spaces. Back when I was doing my master's degree, I was working with a professor who did work with refugee women who had a lot of trauma, sexual trauma, and gender-based violence. And she really noted the importance of, maybe perhaps going into their own homes to have those interviews, being in a familiar and comfortable space for them to actually discuss their experiences. Again, you want to make sure, depending on the level of sensitivity of your topic, you want to make sure that these spaces are safe for them. In other instances, perhaps these women don't actually want to talk to you one-on-one. They may want to talk to you as a group, right? So that's also another example as ways you can create safe spaces for your respondents. If you're thinking of doing this on an online space, or we do have to do most of it online now, you can also apply this. So for instance, if you're doing an online forum, you're connecting with women who have had similar experiences in an online forum, you want to make sure you want to respect their privacy and confidentiality. You want to make sure you're protecting their identities, et cetera, et cetera. So again, there are different ways, tactics, and techniques in terms of how to create safe spaces while you're in the field. And then another thing I want to really bring up here is this, this notion of access and limitations, right? So, as an academic, as a faculty who teaches about research, I wish I could say to all my students that, if you're interested in one topic, you should be allowed to go ahead and do it. But in reality, if you are working with, again, women, depending on the level of seriousness or sensitivity with their topic or with their experiences, if you're working with the queer community, et cetera, you may not always have the right or enough access to even gain that kind of insight or data from these communities. Usually, and I don't know if there is such thing as a perfect way to do research, but usually if you're already part of that community, if you've already shared certain experiences with them, so let's say you are a member of the LGBTQ community and you want to do work with people who you have advocated with, you're part of their community already, you share their experiences, then access will be much easier for you when you do this kind of work. If you are, let's say you're a straight male and you want to do work with, with members of the lesbian community, they might not want to discuss that with you. They might not feel safe with you. So this is also another example of where access and limitations might be present in your work. And sometimes what you'll occupy is an outsider-insider position. I think this is something that I actually went through when I did my fieldwork here in the Philippines during my PhD. So yes, I was an outsider, I'm a foreigner, I'm coming in from the West, et cetera, but also I had some insider experiences. I did grow up still in the Filipino community. I shared a lot of Filipino values. I understood Tagalog. I'm much better now in Tagalog, but I've been here for 4 years. But yeah, I had to learn the language. So there were aspects about my own experiences that gave me insider positionality as well. And then I also want to share an example of what this can look like in the field. So when I was doing that kind of work, I was doing some sort of volunteer work with an organization, with a feminist organization. And there I encountered and met and befriended someone who was from an informal settlement. And so this person actually graciously and generously invited me to do my research with the women in her community, right? So this is a community or a settlement or an area that I would not have regular access to. So I also want to highlight here the importance of gatekeepers and key informants who sort of give you this access, who invite you into their space so that you can do research. And of course, when I actually did this research, she took the lead in terms of getting all the women to discuss their experiences. I really did sit back and I just documented all the data. And of course I shared a lot of my experiences as well. But here again is an example of these respondents being co-producers of your work as well, and not just sitting back and having you extract this kind of data from them, right? Which leads me to again, this constant or consistent, dilemma of trying to eliminate and remove power imbalances when you're in the field, right? So a way to do that, and I think it was also briefly mentioned by Dr. Cabañas in his work yesterday, in his talk yesterday, is you don't want to just expect people to give you all of their personal experiences and stories about struggle, et cetera, et cetera. Usually you have to immerse yourself in this community first. You have to build trust. And a way to do that sometimes is you have to be aware that you also have to exchange your own experiences with these people, right? So it's not just a situation where you take and extract again, but again, you're sharing your own vulnerabilities and your own struggles with them so that it becomes more equal and you create, again, more of an equilibrium between yourself as a researcher and them as your respondents, or again, as co-producers of this work. Then I want to also highlight some methods. So again, this talk really was about methodology. You can apply feminist methodology or objectives to different forms of research techniques or methods. You can do it with participant observation or key informant interviews. But I want to highlight some methods that can be helpful when you do this kind of work. So kwentuhan, and I know you know this as just having everyday conversations, but this is actually becoming more legitimized as a research method in some feminist works. I used it in my work when I published it, when I did the work and published it under my PhD. And also Dr. Valerie Francisco Menchavez employed kwentuhan as a method, as a legitimate method when she did work with migrant women in the US, right? So again, this can actually replicate or even replace a normal focus group discussion. So traditionally when we think of focus group discussion, we envision inviting different participants who may not necessarily know each other into a specific space. We have a set of questions, et cetera, and it can come off as clinical and maybe too technical for a lot of the respondents. kwentuhan usually, and you know this already as as our form of socializing, right? When you have that space where everyone isn't equal, you're not really seen as a researcher, and you're just having that rich everyday or mundane conversation, that can count as your data. So I think that's really something I want to showcase to you here, as using a certain method to try to, again, remove this power imbalance that may be present already because you are the researcher. And then the other two things I want to also showcase is the importance of also oral histories and narratives. So again, because we're trying to, or attempting to, make sure that women's experiences, the queer community's experiences are visible, we want to give that opportunity, maybe through oral histories and also narratives. So giving them that opportunity to speak, share their stories, and also sharing their own narratives. So this was my last slide. I want to leave it off here, but I also wanted to, before getting to the Q&A, I also want to, I wanted to mention that this talk seems overly, it seems like doing feminist research is always about being overly critical and always trying to dismantle every kind of power imbalance, et cetera, et cetera. But in the field, when you actually do this work, it can be really enriching, right? So I did do work on, I did do serious topics when I was in the field, but I also did other types of research with women that weren't so serious or weren't so dire. So I think Dr. Cabañas mentioned that I worked with him on a project that looked at middle-class women and their dating experiences here in Metro Manila and how they use mobile apps to connect with foreigners, right? So yes, when we presented this data in a chapter, we're referring to different types of frameworks and theoretical discussions, but in reality, we're really just going out and having these very light conversations with these respondents, right? We're sharing experiences about relationships and about dating, et cetera, and also about intimacy. So this research, can also just be filled with joy, right? So I want to highlight that as well. I don't want it to always seem like it's a serious matter. And it's something I really miss doing since the pandemic. So I want to leave you with that and not just say, we always have to think about our positionality. We always have to think about where we come from in terms of our privilege. Doing work with women, doing work with any community is really enriching, and I want to make sure I said that. So that was where I want to leave off, and I'm happy to engage with you for further dialogue. So thank you for engaging with this.
Thank you, Dr. Collantes. And now it is time for the Q&A. We have several questions in the Q&A box and the chat box as well, and a raised hand. And I'd like to start with the raised hand to encourage the ladies to speak up, okay? So, and the raised hand is from Dr. Rohane Derongongan, and Dr. Rohane, you may speak now.
Good morning. Good morning, sir. Good morning, Dr. Collantes.
Hello po.
Okay, sige po. Ganito po yung akin. It's actually more or less something to do with the dilemma in the, what they call this one, in the field, as well as for ethical consideration. You have experienced a scenario where a key informant, after sharing all her experiences, her information, the very thing that you really want to extract from her, very healthy, after a very healthy open discussion, would like to retract, and after a few days tried to reach you and would like to withdraw all what she said. What do you do now with the data?
That's a really good question. I think in any sort of research, so not just feminist research, if a participant or respondent wants to withdraw their data from your project, then you respect that, right? I think that applies also to journalism and to other forms of reportage or any kind of scholarship, right? So that is applicable at any time of the research process. So even if you are close to publication and months later someone says, I don't actually want to be included in this, then you respect that, right? And one of the ways to do this is to keep the collaboration going even after the fieldwork, right? So what feminist scholars tend to do is they show their work to the respondents and they say, this is what I wrote up. Can you take a look and see if you feel okay about it? Do I still have your consent to share your narratives in my work? And so it doesn't really end, that relationship doesn't necessarily end just after you have that conversation in the field or after you've already extracted that information or insight when you were doing field work. It's ongoing, it's continuous. So that's one way to do it. But yes, the simple answer is, you respect it. If they don't want to be included, you can try to say, I'll change your name or I'll use a pseudonym, I'll keep you anonymous in some way. But if they don't want to be there at all, then you just respect that decision. I hope that answers you.
Thank you very much, Dr.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Rohana. And I will ask the first question in the chat box. I mean in the Q&A box. And it goes, I'm not sure if this question makes sense, but is public textual profanity, rudeness, or impoliteness considered safe spaces under feminism, regardless of its countering power or establishing power? And can you please turn off your share screen, Dr. Collantes?
Oh yeah, sure, I will. 1 second. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was still up. Stop share. Okay, there you go.
So shall I repeat the question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So it goes, I'm not sure if this question makes sense, but is public textual profanity, rudeness, or impoliteness considered safe spaces under feminism, regardless of its countering power or establishing power?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It depends on the respondent and how they feel comfortable with that, right? So again, depending on what you're exploring in your work, you also want to validate people's ways of expressing themselves. So if you are perhaps doing work, again, I'll use the same example of doing work with women who have experienced some sort of gender-based violence. Sometimes the way they will express their experiences is they'll use profanity. And you don't want to censor that, right? You want to try to acknowledge it. You want to include it as long as, again, they feel safe in expressing it. Because we also want to validate their feelings. So if they are angry about a specific experience that they had, you don't want to say, please don't swear during this session, right? If they want to express themselves with profanity, then yes, you allow them to do that, again, because we're validating their emotions and their ways of expressing their emotions, and not just trying to, again, just extract bits and parts of that insight or that interview. We're trying to think of everything as a whole, and that can include just them using curse words or profanity. So again, it depends, but that's my answer, and that's my example for that question.
Okay, so that question was from an anonymous attendee.
Okay.
The next question comes from Federico Filipino. And well, basically, as a scholar of gender studies, he's curious on how a woman can apply theories which will empower them at home. And are there instances, or would you know of instances when women would, when a husband would resist, or how can women manage it when that happens?
I mean, this is no longer about research, right? This is about how women manage their everyday lives. And if they are in situations where they are dealing with an angry husband or some sort of, again, gender-based violence, theory is not going to help. Theory is not going to help at all. It's genuine help and advice, right? You try, depending on the seriousness of that situation, there have to be ways you support that woman. You have to find ways to support and offer support and try to remove them from that situation and from the circumstances, right? So again, this is not really about research, but how do women manage their everyday lives, especially if it's consistently uneven or violent. So instead of saying, what theories would help, I would say what paradigms would help, and you can think of feminist theory or feminist research as being kind of this abstract thing that we try to apply in scholarship, but feminism as a political movement, as something you want to adopt into your own everyday life is, you want to empower them, find ways to empower them. And usually how this happens is, again, you create space for support, you make sure you're there. So these are really practical ways of doing it that is not really related to academia or again, modes of inquiry, right? So, but I wish I could answer that as a counselor or as someone who deals more frequently with these kinds of situations, but really I'm still coming from a place of just doing research.
We have a question from Jane Ruby Aspirin. And she says, I appreciate what you said about feminist research as usually interdisciplinary. Is it also safe to say that feminist researches have differences or uniqueness among regions, East, West, Christian countries, Muslim countries in the world? And if so, what would be these major differences?
I would absolutely say so. I'm not prepared to talk about all the different ways feminism or feminist research differs depending on geography or depending on region, but it depends as well. Like, for instance, if you are coming from a post-colonial setting, then usually what you'll do is you'll incorporate or you'll merge or combine not just feminist theory or feminist research, but you'll also use post-colonialism as a theory, as a theoretical framework, or as a way to analyze the data, right? If you are in, if the primary experience has to do with religion or religious, being a religious minority or whatnot, then you're not just analyzing it from a feminist standpoint. You're looking at religious, religious texts or religious paradigms or teachings to inform your work. So it's always, I wouldn't say it differs based on region or geography. I think it just differs based on the experiences, right? So if you're looking at, another example is if you're looking at, I will actually use Metro Manila. So, when I am doing work on women or with women in an area such as Metro Manila or the Philippines, I can't just talk about feminism, or I can't just use gender analysis. I have to consider, especially when I did work with or on reproductive politics, I had to consider, religious identities and faithful communities and how that shaped or impacted their opinions about reproductive rights here during that time, or even until now. I had to talk about class as well, right? So women's experiences were different in the city depending on their socioeconomic level. So again, this goes back to being interdisciplinary. So I think that's also a way to answer your question, right? It's not always going to be just about feminism or feminist theory. It's going to incorporate or integrate other theories or other ways to analyze your insights.
Getting a lot of good questions, huh?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Well, the next one is asking for suggestions.
Sure.
What research methods can you use to study gender differences on language use or vocabulary use?
Can I have more context on that, or is that?
It's from an anonymous attendee and there's no more detail.
Okay, no problem. I don't know how to answer that fully, actually, or sufficiently at this moment. Sorry, is it asking about research methods?
Methods.
Okay, so I think the way I'll answer it is, you would use the traditional way to do any sort of research on languages or language differences, right? So let's say you're a sociolinguist or you do linguistic work. So the actual methods don't change. It's the analysis that changes, right? So you would of course try to make sure that your design is inclusive. So you're identifying your participants as being equal. So you have men and women and whatnot. And so you maintain that traditional design, but then when you analyze it, you would say, women, I wouldn't even know what your research question is, to be honest, but let's say women are more, I don't know how to, because I don't actually know the project, but you would say men or women maybe are more fluent in one or engaged in one or learn one language, depending again on your research question. But yeah, the methods for that specific discipline wouldn't necessarily change. The objectives would change, again, because feminism or feminist research has core principles or objectives rather than a separate way of doing an actual research design, right? So the objectives change. You can make the objectives more feminist. I don't know if this is really not the same thing, because you're asking about linguistics, but another way I would look at it is perhaps, let's say you want to do psychology and you want to look at trauma. So, you would still use a similar design in the way you'd use with any other sample population, right? But the objective is to look at maybe gender-based violence trauma. And then the analysis would be feminist. So you'd say, women in these situations are perhaps abusive relationships or situations of domestic violence experience this kind of trauma because of those incidents, right? So again, the design doesn't change, but the objectives and the analysis is what makes it feminist as well.
The next one is from Anifa Alonto. Have you done a study or know of a study that assesses how social media has influenced general perception of sexual identities, particularly on how it has boosted acceptance of the plurality of sexual identities?
That's a really great question. I have not yet done a similar study, and I cannot at this moment name specific studies or scholars to you, but I know they're out there. The researchers who are incorporating work on media, social media, on sexuality, sexual politics, on gender. I mean, they're out there. I just have not yet encountered them, just because of my own personal reasons. I'm not neglecting this scholarship. It's more that I'm just occupied with other research. But I know they're out there, and I'm happy to recommend something afterwards. Yeah, just to give you more insight.
Pat Ray Dagapioso has a question. In researching episodes of violence and oppression, for example, LGBT experiences of violence and discrimination, what are the possible techniques or methods to make the research not traumatizing and is empowering to the research participants?
Yeah, that's a complex question, again, because I mentioned safe spaces as one way of making sure that it's not re-traumatizing. Trauma itself is already a very particular experience, right? So in terms of research methods, I can give you very simple answers and say, yes, you can, again, create a safe space. You can make sure the respondents are anonymous in the study. You can make sure, you can always ask for consent continuously throughout the research process, again, if they still want to be included in the work. But, when you do work that's that sensitive, to make sure it's not re-traumatizing, usually that community will have to really call the shots in terms of how you're collecting this data, right? They are going to be the ones to guide and direct the conversation. They're going to be the ones to invite you in their space. They're going to decide how they feel safe when working with you on that project. And this goes back to my point about this kind of work being collaborative. So you may not have that answer in terms of how to not re-trigger a community and their experiences of that kind of violence and that kind of trauma. They will give you that signal, and that's important to acknowledge.
And now from Perselindo Dingding. Have you come about some studies on women's brutality against men? If not, could this be a good study on women?
Yeah, that could be taken as a controversial question, by the way, just because feminist scholars, some feminist activists even tend to say, well, yes, women have, there are incidents, there are cases of women's abuse towards men, but traditionally, gender-based violence against women have been ignored. But yes, I cannot name or list someone or any particular studies now, but I do know that there is a scholarship, and it might not even be feminist, right? It might just be looking at just this phenomenon of, violence happening where women are the perpetrators and men are the victims. I would actually categorize that under maybe not feminist research, but gender research. So looking at men's experiences when it comes to that kind of struggle, right? So it's definitely out there. I just don't think it would be considered feminist, right? I think it would still be part of the social sciences, though. Yeah.
And from an anonymous attendee, gender studies still seem offensive to some conservative cultures in our country,
Yeah.
where some questions are not allowed to be asked. What are your thoughts on some restrictions placed on some gender researches?
Yeah. Still trying to consider what's being asked here. I think there are always going to be some sort of limitations when you do that kind of work in a specific area or society where it can be seen as controversial. I wouldn't necessarily think that gender research is more unaccepted. I would say feminist research can come off as being really controversial, more so than just gender research. I think if you, formulate or frame your own work as looking just at gender differences or gendered experiences without having this feminist objective, it might be easier to conduct that kind of study if that particular context isn't so welcoming to feminist scholarship, right? So I'm trying to think of an example, but let's say you want to, and again, I don't like always using serious examples, but I'm going to stick with this one. So let's say there are studies, for instance, I think this is like counseling and psychology and whatnot, but there are studies where, where researchers are trying to figure out why men commit domestic violence, right? And then so, actually, I know one person, I forgot, I think its name is Lundy Bancroft, I'm not sure, but he has done a lot of work in terms of trying to get into the heads of abusive men, right? So in that space, in that research design, it looks like, and he's a male, so he's going in there and he's just doing this kind of research. He's trying to gather these insights and these reasonings behind men's abusive behavior. But when he actually wrote it out later on, it's actually very feminist. So he talks about how men do this because of certain reasons, and he's trying to actually write this for women who experience abusive relationships or who have experienced domestic violence, what to identify as being abusive behavior, and then what to actually do if you're in that in those circumstances. So that's an example, right? So perhaps those men wouldn't want to feel, like they're being used in this kind of project. But when it was actually happening, he was really just gathering and collecting information on that kind of behavior that served women later on, or women who are in those relationships later on.
The next question is not really methodological. It's from Gaudencio M. Alaya I Jr. And he's asking, how can you stop or minimize gender discrimination in salaries and wages in Southeast Asia?
I wish I had the answer for you. It has to do with a lot of advocacy, a lot of identifying that that this is even an issue, and then making sure that you are collaborating or making these causes known with policymakers, right, or with the corporations or workplaces themselves. So again, I don't want to be the expert on this. I want to share my my knowledge on research. But if you're asking about actual gender discrimination in the workforce, there have been a lot of women's labor rights groups who have talked about this. Some other gender equality groups, other feminist groups who are already doing this kind of advocacy. So we just have to keep connecting them with policymakers, with again the leaders of these corporations or these companies or these institutions to make sure that equal pay is being given, that's being offered, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the best thing we can do. But I will say that there are a lot of pieces of legislation that work out for these objectives. So the Magna Carta for Women in 2009. That's an important act that tries to make sure that gender pay is present, or that discrimination isn't happening in public and private spaces. And then the Safe Spaces Act is something that we can also refer to in terms of creating or making sure that we are participating in an equal and safe environment, whether it's in the workplace or in education and healthcare and whatnot. So.
Certainly an important question. The last one is from an anonymous attendee, and it's a bit specific. Okay, good morning. I'm interested in conducting a research on female gardeners or farmers during the pandemic. Can you suggest any titles? I hope it's not asking too much. Okay.
Actually, you know what? To that anonymous individual, I please email me and let's work on that. I don't know if I can think of it as quickly as now to do it for you here. But, I think when you figure out your research questions, when you figure out exactly what you're trying to explore in your project, then the title will come up in your head. It'll sort of take form. But if you are genuinely asking for, assistance with that, just feel free to email me and I'd be happy to collaborate with you on the title.
Yeah, just please contact the organizers for the email address. So that was the last question. Do you have any parting words, Dr. Collantes?
No, I just want to thank everyone for their questions, actually. I was really excited to have this exchange with all of you. Some of you really did stump me with some of your inquiries, but that's good. And I'm glad that some of these were challenging as well. It's a lot to think about in terms of how you want to actually go about and do this sort of scholarship, but I hope it was helpful to you. And I know there's a lot to think about, but again, I want to just reiterate that it's really rewarding and meaningful work. You do, again, build solidarity with your respondents, you do form communities. So I hope that all of you do get to engage in this kind of research and see where it takes you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Collantes. So ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Christianne F. Collantes.
Thank you, everyone.
And now we shall proceed to the next session, which is my session, actually. So please allow me to introduce myself. So the title of my presentation is Oral History Research in Contemporary Times. And well, I'm an associate professor of the Department of History at DLSU University, and I'm also the director of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. And I hold a degree in history from the University of the Philippines in Diliman. So let me now proceed to my presentation slides. So, as already mentioned, my discussion will be about the oral history method. And well, I was hoping to discuss more contemporary history research methods, but I think time will permit me to talk about only digital humanities. But before I begin, I would prefer to begin actually with a discussion of the fundamentals, because I know that not everyone in the audience, well, not all of you are historians. So it's very important to clarify certain details just to be sure that we're on the same boat. And the first question I'd like to address is, what is history? For some people, history is synonymous to the past. But to historians, the two words are not. The past is the past. It is what happened. It is the actual truth. But history is a mere reconstruction of the past. So the past is what transpired. Only God knows the totality of it. Even people who experience the past do not see the entire picture. Okay, and history is how historians have selected from the remnants of the past, be they details from historical documents, stories, even social memory, okay, and put together, the cohesive narrative becomes history. And since there could be different interpretations of these remnants, then there could be as many versions as of the past as there are historians. So there can be as many histories as there are historians. History is thus man-made. It is not necessarily the absolute truth, okay? Because again, the past, that's the absolute truth. History is a historian's interpretation of the past. The word history comes from Greece in ancient times, where it meant simply an inquiry. The act of seeking knowledge, as well as the results, okay, as well as the knowledge that results from inquiry. It is a record of events. So you have to remember that in very ancient times, the Greeks, okay, already developed philosophy as a means of addressing their concerns. So using logic and reason, they were able to gain some comfort, okay, in having some understanding of the phenomena around them. But there were individuals who were not satisfied, okay, with just logic and reason, and wanted to rely more on, observable, okay, and not necessarily quantifiable, but to some extent quantifiable factors. And that's really how the discipline began. So, what is history? It is a historian's reconstruction of the past. And secondly, while it is a record of events, okay, it is a record of events that addresses, okay, an inquiry. Now, traditionally, historical narratives were simply unified narratives, okay, using data, okay, to reconstruct the past. But later, historians have also learned the importance of contextualizing texts and concepts in their period, in their geography, and in their culture. So you'll notice that while there are historical works that focus on the who, the what, the when, the where, and the sequence or the chronology of events, there are others who spend much time on deconstructing, criticizing, okay, the historical sources, and the discussion of such context becomes the main focus instead of the historical study. Now, why do we study history? Well, first, because it explains. It provides solutions to problems. Okay, so questions that are asked can be given the answers by history. So questions like, where did we come from? Who are we? Okay, who am I? Okay, so though these questions can also be given philosophical answers, okay, history has its way of providing the answers by looking at the past. History can also create identity. Nations are often built on a common sense of a shared past. Okay, it can create a personal identity. Okay, like thinking of yourself as a product of experience, looking back at what you've been through, or maybe beyond the individual, okay, your immediate community, your family, your community. Having that sense of a common experience can also create an identity or explain an identity. Well, some people also study history for mere entertainment. Okay, some people love reading about history. They enjoy different aspects of the past. There are history buffs who focus on warfare. We have historians who study food. Okay, we have historians who study society, culture, religion. Okay, well, of course, politics, economics. There are no boundaries. But some people They study history simply because it entertains them. Now, there are two general views on history. The academic view is that it is an interpretation of the past based on the critical analysis of primary sources. And primary sources are first-hand accounts. These are evidences from the time itself. And when all of these accounts are put together, the historian therefore selects, okay, which facts are important and which are not, which are more credible than others, etc., etc. They're put together, and what is constructed is a history based on the historical sources. Now, the other view is that history is built on multiple sources, such as oral traditions, popular culture, and commemorations that fulfill diverse social and political needs. And well, basically, this is history based on the social memory. Okay, and while the first view is what we associate with academic historians, okay, the second view is what's more popular with public historians. Okay, and the general public would often think of history in the second way. But there are some differences. For well, the first one, okay, is what we refer to as historical awareness, recognizes that the past is connected but separate from the present. In other words, while the present is a continuation of the past is so distinct, okay, that it must be studied. One cannot simply understand the past by relying, okay, on one's perceptions of the past. It has to be studied. A famous historian once said that the past is a different country. Okay, it is foreign. So since it is beyond our consciousness, it requires understanding. And every age, okay, so not just the past in general, but every era, every period of the past is unique and must be understood on its own terms. So historicism thus promotes the awareness of the autonomy of the past, okay, and thus it requires training and education, which makes it exclusive, and essentially that's how academic history happens to be. So historians who studied the discipline, some would even think, okay, that they are different from ordinary mortals in the sense that they have the capability to transport themselves to a different time and a different place using their minds. I'm not like that, okay, but there are historians in the past who have endeavored to be such individuals and who have claimed to be such individuals. So by developing an expertise of a certain era or epoch, then they believe that they can actually go back to the past, like their minds as time machines. So that's historical awareness, essentially the idea that the past and the present are connected, but they are different. Okay, and the past therefore must be studied and understood. Now, social memory, on the other hand, is based on the past as it is remembered. Okay, it is sometimes referred to as collective memory too, okay, because it is based on the collective experience. Therefore, since it is remembered and based on the collective experience, then it is within everyone's reach. So as already mentioned, public history is rooted in social memory. It's more relatable, okay? It is what you've heard since you were growing up. It's what your parents told you or your grandparents told you about. So it's not as restrictive as the idea of historical awareness, because in this instance, anyone can be a historian. All you need is passion and interest, okay? And with just passion and interest, you can actually construct your own credible history. In fact, many amateur historians are driven solely by passion. Okay, so many of them are not even historians by training, but yet they are able to produce credible works of history nonetheless. So it's more inclusive, And again, this is the foundation of public history. Now, well, let me now proceed to the contemporary historical research methods that I will discuss, with my main focus on oral history, which I believe bridges the gap between academic and public history. I'll explain that later. And the latter part of my presentation, I'll discuss digital archives research, okay, which is one of the methods of the digital humanities. But let me first discuss oral history, the oral history method. And I will guide you through the method later. But first, what is oral history and why do we do it? The simplest definition is that it is a research methodology that records oral stories drawn from memories of first-person witnesses. So this comes from Schoenfield's oral history methodology. It's a simple yet complete definition because it mentions that it's a research method. It involves recording, okay, because oral history has been used since the earliest days of of history, since Greek times. Okay, the interview, which is the basic equivalent of oral history, has been used to gather historical information. But the term oral history, as we understand it today, involves a recording device. Therefore, in the modern sense, when we talk about oral history, it's not the mere collection of data using interview. It includes the recording of the information using a recording device. So in the mid-20th century, they were using tape recorders. Okay, later, digital recorders. And now everyone can record using their cell phones. So you don't even need to buy any additional equipment. In fact, beyond recording voice, you can also video record using your cell phones, which is a far better method of recording than mere audio recording. The next component is that it is drawn from memories of first-person witnesses. In other words, the narratives are based on personal experience. And that's what makes it a primary source. Now, why do we do oral history? The method became popular immediately after the Second World War, when people realized that many historical documents were destroyed. So there was an immediate sense of need, okay, to capture as much about the past that would not be found in the documents. At the same time, there were also individuals who recognized that the immediate memories of that experience, the Second World War, had to be captured right away for posterity. Okay, so while you can use oral history to retrieve the past. You can ask people who were there 50 years ago about what they remember. So that's, in a sense, retrieving the past from people's memory. Another use of oral history is to preserve, okay, memories by recording them right away. So in other words, it's not a retrieval, rather you are preserving memories for posterity. Historians, of course, are not, well, one of the arguments against oral history actually is that historians do not create their own sources. Okay, so in this sense, you are creating your own source. But some historians have done it, not for their own use, okay, but for the use of the next generation. So at least they'll have something to work with. Now, it's also important to highlight that oral history and oral tradition are not the same. Okay, because some people are of the impression that they are synonymous. They are not. And again, the main difference is that oral history is based on first-hand experiences, while oral tradition is information passed down from generation to generation. Therefore, they are not based on a person's actual experience, not something he or she saw, heard or felt, okay, etc. Rather, oral tradition is more of knowledge that has been transmitted from one person to another, from one generation to the next. Now, oral tradition is also very important, and in many countries, you'll actually find oral traditions, um, preserved in the same place as oral histories. Okay, so but they are classified separately because they serve different purposes. Now, before I proceed to the methodology, the step-by-step, there are some issues that have to be discussed. Because, as I said earlier, some historians actually object to the use of oral history as a methodology, okay? Particularly the positivist historians. And one argument against oral history is that it is based on memory, which is very unreliable. Memory can be affected by false memories, self-perception, physical deterioration, and simply time. Because, psychological studies have shown that, our own experiences can be altered by what we are exposed to later. So we may remember a certain event, but then we see a movie about that event, and somehow scenes from the movie become part of our own memory and they distort, okay, how we remember our experience. Self-perception affects the way we remember our past. People who have a high regard of themselves or for themselves, the ones who see themselves as kings, leaders, okay, may view the past from such a perspective, instead of having a more, uh, rather objective, okay, point of view. In the same way that people who see themselves as being at the bottom, okay, may also affect they perceive their own past. Physical deterioration can affect your memory. Aging, we all know its effects. And memory simply fades. Time has that effect on memory. So what we experienced last year during the early days of the pandemic, for example, some of the details may still be very clear. Okay, we may have flashbulb memories of that experience, but had I asked you to give me details about the first day of the pandemic at your place, the amount of detail that you could provide will not likely be as much had I asked you the same question a month, okay, after the pandemic started last year. So time simply has that effect. And of course, psychologists have also found that the past is constantly being reinterpreted. Okay, so in our minds, we're constantly reinterpreting the past. Therefore, our memories just get altered over time. Our impressions, okay, just change. Now, subjectivity is another criticism against oral history. For one's political, social, cultural, religious, gender, okay, among other backgrounds, can also affect the way you view things. So right now, you may have your views about current events, okay, and well, none of us are objective. We are all subjective in our own respective ways, okay. And lastly, the influence of social memory. In oral history, we expect the narrator to talk about his or her own personal experience. But then, as already mentioned earlier, social memory also is a factor. The social memory becomes embedded. So memory is not it's not a personal and an individual thing. There is a social engagement involved in even our memories. So how are these issues against oral history addressed? Well, when the concern is the reliability of the narration, then the historian's techniques of corroboration and verification can be applied. Okay, you don't have to accept all words mentioned in an oral history, hook, line, and sinker. You can cross-check with periodicals. You can interview other people, okay, and then decide later on whether or not which accounts or which narratives are more credible. But historians have also come to recognize the need for interdisciplinarity. It's not enough anymore to rely solely on the methods and techniques of the historical discipline. While it is a very old discipline, okay, we have learned to adopt techniques of social psychology, anthropology, sociology, and other related disciplines in determining the reliability of oral histories. So the methods of psychology, anthropology, and sociology are particularly useful, okay, in this endeavor. Now, on the issue of subjectivity, well, the argument against it is that, well, it reveals not only the meaning of subjectivity reveals not only the meaning of historical experience, but also the relationship of past and present, meaning and identity, and individual and collective. This comes from Alistair Thompson. So in other words, when you conduct an oral history, it is not enough anymore simply to gather names, dates, and places and events, okay, information about it, the chronology, etc. You also have to dwell into, okay, the psychology of the person being interviewed, the context of the memory, okay, and how time, okay, may have already affected the way the past is remembered. Just to illustrate the point, you know, after People Power, some individuals who were interviewed were asked what they could say about the Marcos administration. And many said that it was the worst experience of their lives. Marcos was the worst president ever, okay, etc., etc. So the spirit of EDSA was very strong, okay, and there was a very strong anti-Marcos sentiment as well. So the way people remembered the whole era of martial law was that it was a very dark era. But events happened, okay, beyond 1986. And by the 1990s, when some of these same individuals were interviewed, they changed their minds. So they were then saying that martial law was not so bad after all. Okay, somehow Marcos was not really the worst president ever. So you see how in the span of a little over a decade, okay, the perception of the past was altered. So our present conditions, our present experiences, okay, may also alter our memories of not only the distant past, but also our immediate past. So subjectivity is just part of the game, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, for subjectivity will allow you to better understand, okay, the narrative. Now, lastly, deconstructing memory requires more than factual analysis. Okay, so as already mentioned, you also have to apply linguistic, narrative, cultural, psychoanalytical, and ethnographic analysis in such studies. So again, what I'm emphasizing is the need for historians to be more open, okay, to the techniques and methods of other disciplines. Interdisciplinarity is a reality. Okay, it is something we need, and it is something that will enhance the discipline. Now, how do we do oral history? So I'll now talk about the method. It involves the following steps. So it's not only, an interview that makes an oral history an oral history. The method involves several steps, from preparation to the interview itself, to the transcription, corroboration and verification of facts, and then the interpretation or the, developing insights about the interview. So there are several types of interviews that can be used in oral history. And the most general would be structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. A structured interview is one that is strictly based on a questionnaire. So I know many of you have, applied the interview as a research method, and I don't really need to go too much into detail. Okay, but basically it's one where you have a set of questions and you only ask those questions. You don't go beyond the questions in your questionnaire. Sometimes the questionnaires are very long and very specific, okay, because you have a clear idea of what you want to find out. Okay, so that's what what is referred to as a structured interview. A semi-structured interview is one that is also guided by a questionnaire, but which allows the interviewer to digress. So essentially, you know, if the narrator says something very interesting or something you find to be quite interesting, then you can pursue that topic even if it is not part of your original plan. So the semi-structured interview is one where you have an outline of your interview, and where you are permitted to digress and pursue other issues that you find interesting, and then you can always go back to your questionnaire. Now, the last one is the unstructured interview. So essentially, it's anything goes. And well, I use this method myself. Okay, sometimes I start oral history projects with unstructured interviews to get a better, you know, idea of the field. You know, the extent by which we can discuss a certain topic. Because there are instances when we set our minds to certain issues that we lose the opportunity, okay, to discover others that are simply unknown or untapped. So I've found the unstructured approach to be quite helpful. So when I conduct oral histories, I start with the unstructured approach, and then I follow up with a semi-structured approach. And then normally for a third interview, if necessary, then the structured approach, where I call it the sniper interview, because I ask, okay, very definite clarificatory questions usually. But the most popular interview method in oral history, at least in the historical discipline, is the semi-structured approach, as many of you have probably found to be also the most convenient. Now, in preparation for the interview, so whether you're doing a structured, semi-structured, or unstructured oral history, you have to prepare. You can't just go, you know, and dive without any prior knowledge of the topic or the subject matter. So you have to develop or determine a clear topic and or theme. So what you need to do is to do background research, not only on the topic, but also on the person to be interviewed. Because as you can see here on the list, the last item is informed consent. And well, the informed consent is an ethical, you know, it's a tool we use to ensure research ethics. And the basic, you know, the fundamental principle in research ethics is do no harm. When you do background study, a background study on your interviewee, it's not only to determine the person's credibility, okay, which is very important, okay? So you do a background study to ensure that the person you're interviewing is the right person for your interest. But it's also to find out if there are certain issues or sensibilities that you should be aware of. Because of course, unfortunately, many historical events are also traumatic experiences for those who went through them. So let me just give an example to illustrate the point. You know, early in my career as a historian, I met an activist who I knew went through the, you know, he was tortured basically during martial law. And being young and, you know, trying my best to be objective, I asked permission to interview him specifically on the torture methods applied on him, because I wanted to do a study on the torture, okay, during the martial law era. And well, the person politely declined by simply saying that, you know, I'd really like to help you out, but I'd prefer to forget that experience. And it was then that I realized that I wasn't being, you know, humane. I was too robotic. I was too clinical in my approach because, you know, as a young historian, I was trained to be objective. But oral history requires a degree of sensitivity. So it's important that you also do a background, you know, research on the person you're interviewing, so as to know how to ask questions properly, and if there are issues where you should be careful. Okay, because of course, the last thing you would want to do is to trigger trauma. Okay, and that would be unethical. Now, the next one, as part of the preparation, would be to ensure that your recording and backup devices are ready for the task. At one point, I was doing, oral history very heavily. One interview to another, and I did have an experience where I simply ran out of batteries. Okay, so I learned from that experience how important it was to have a backup device. So today, when I do oral histories, aside from video, which I use, I also audio record. Okay, and if I can, I even use 2 cameras. I've done an interview where I have 2 cameras from different angles. And well, lastly, as part of the preparation is the informed consent. Now, your respective institutions may already have standard templates, but you will easily find examples online. Okay, so many institutions have been very generous, and of course, you are permitted to simply copy or print out their informed consent. But I want to show you the informed consent that we use at De La Salle University. This is the informed consent of the Department of History. And essentially, the components include a little detail about the narrator, the subject matter. So you have to inform the narrator what the interview will be about, contact details. Okay, so they'll know how to get in touch with you after the interview. And then we explain to them why we feel that we should interview them specifically. Okay, so why them? The purpose of the interview. Okay, we tell them that it will last, let's say, more or less an hour. The interview will be recorded. I don't see it in this one. I may have uploaded the wrong version, but we also usually state the possible risks, okay, of engaging in the interview. So it's also sort of a warning that some people might be offended by certain details. So there could be a possibility of a suit, like somebody might sue him or her, okay, because of something he or she would say. So just as a warning. And then we ask the participant to confirm that they have read the the informed consent, that they agree voluntarily to participate, okay, that they agree to it being recorded, they agree to its publication, they agree to it being deposited in a repository that we will inform them of, okay, etc., etc. Of course, I don't know if you can read it here, but it also states that at any point in time, they can withdraw, okay, from the interview, even after the interview itself. Okay, earlier there was a question about the decision of a narrator to withdraw data shared. And well, in oral history, we allow them to withdraw, at least before it is published. So that we make it clear that should they change their minds about the interview, if they want it, let's say, just erase everything, then we have to respect, okay, such views. Now, moving on to the interview process. I'm looking at the time. Yeah, so I still have some time. There are certain things to keep in mind when you conduct oral history. First, remember that the interview is an interactive process. Okay, so it's not just you asking like a robot, like a machine. And your narrator is also not a machine who should simply respond. There's a social dimension to an interview. You don't only ask questions, you also, relate, you feel. Okay, you develop a relationship when you engage in oral history. So here are just some quick do's and don'ts. So, well, it's best if you can show good knowledge of the subject, because it encourages the narrator to tell you more about whatever you're discussing. When you show that you've done background research, then you give well, you prove, not, you don't just give the impression, but you actually prove to the narrator that you're really interested. Okay, so you're not there just to use him or her to get information, but you are interested in him or her as well as a person. So a good knowledge of the subject matter always enhances the quality of the oral history. It gives you an idea of what questions you should ask, what questions have been asked, what questions remain, okay, to be asked. Now, you have to be patient. That's another important thing to consider. You cannot force your narrator to divulge information right away. You have to feel, okay, your way through it. Dr. Liana yesterday talked about the importance of interpersonal relations, okay, pakikipagkapwa. You have to understand how certain individuals may see you as an outsider or perhaps even a stranger. So yung pakikitungo, okay? So, and they may not open up immediately. So if you have a question that you sense is quite sensitive, you can opt to ask the question in the latter part of the interview or on a different day. But do encourage elaboration. While you should be patient, okay, if the narrator gives a short reply and you think a little more detail can be useful, then please encourage elaboration. For sometimes it's not the intent of the narrator just to not share, okay, information. They just don't think it is important. So when you encourage elaboration, then they realize that certain details are needed. Of course, do not interrupt the narrator. Always wait for the narrator to finish speaking before asking the next question. If you do unintentionally, okay, cut or interrupt the narrator, then please go back or request the narrator to go back to what he or she was saying. The next one is very important to many of you. I'm sure it's common sense, but do not lead the narrator towards certain answers. Sometimes you don't do it intentionally, but it happens. I've found myself doing that in some instances in the past. So there's a need to be self-aware of your own, subjectivity. So when you sense that you are leading your narrator towards certain answers, then you have to find a way to remedy that. And then, of course, do not make biased comments, because when you make biased comments, it also influences the narrator's narrative. Forgot to mention that at the beginning of an interview, I normally read out the informed consent. So the papers I showed you earlier, okay, I read them out so that it will not just, the consent will not just be on paper, it will be recorded in the actual interview. So just in case something happens to the informed consent. Now so I need to make time for the open forum, but the remaining components of oral history are transcription, corroboration, interpretation, and storage. The interview, of course, is the soul of the oral history. Okay, that's in essence what it is. But transcription, okay, was always or has always been an important component of the oral history method. For in the past, recording devices were very expensive. So even the tape, okay, was expensive. So when they recorded interviews, they transcribed them so that they can use the tape again. Because you can record over tape. For the younger generation, you probably don't know this, but you can record over tape over and over again. So since tape was quite expensive in the mid-20th century, the interviews were immediately transcribed. So they would put the words onto paper, and then the interview would usually be bound, okay, together with the introduction and the interpretation, and thus serve as a historical document for researchers. Now, times have changed because, as mentioned earlier, we now have, recording devices are so cheap these days that practically everyone who has a cell phone, or everyone who has a cell phone, practically has a recording device. And secondly, saving these files will not really be as expensive as they used to be. Okay, you still need to have storage, but it is far more convenient, okay, to save such interviews now than in the past. So there's no need to erase and tape over, which leads to the question of whether or not the transcription is even necessary. The problem with most oral history projects is that they end in the interview, okay, the recorded interview, because transcription is the most difficult task. An hour-long interview can take 3 hours to transcribe. Okay, I'm referring to manual transcription. There are automated transcription, there is automated transcription now. Okay, so here are some examples. Otter AI, you can just search it online. Even your Google Docs can be used. Okay, so just go to Google Docs and use voice typing. So play the recording and it essentially transcribes the interview. But personally, as a practitioner of oral history, I really see no need for the transcription, because I think of it as an intervention which can affect the accuracy of the interview. Because when we transcribe, of course, we interpret, we select which words are more important, where to put the comma, where to put quotation marks, etc., etc. And that can alter, okay, the actual meaning of what was stated. And I have encountered some lousy transcriptions, okay, that are not even close to the actual interviews. So I've become quite distrustful of transcriptions. But in light of how convenient it is now, okay, to preserve recordings, all that may be necessary is a detailed description of the interview, the questionnaire, okay, and perhaps an index of important words or lead words that will be useful to researchers. And frankly, I think that would be sufficient. Now, historians, part of our training is to be in a constant state of doubt. So our training is to not believe right away. Okay, don't believe everything you see. So that's why we do corroboration. So when a narrator says a certain detail, and we feel, okay, that it is too different from common knowledge, let's put it that way, then we have to cross-check with other references, okay, or other people, and if we can't find any, then we can state our reservations or thoughts on the subject matter or the topic as a footnote in the transcription. Now, the last one is interpretation, which involves the selection of facts, the recognition of the limitations of memory, and the meaning of the interview. So like I said earlier, going into some of the methods and techniques used by the allied social sciences of history. And lastly, storage is also another factor, because if you cite your oral history in a historical study, then people will expect or some people may expect to use the same interview. So you have to be able to share your oral history with other people by preserving it in an established repository like the school libraries, a community library, or your own personal collection. Okay. Some of these collections are now going online, which I will also discuss in a bit. But there are important points to consider. First, there's a cultural context in oral history. The way we interview is governed by the cultural context. So while we may think of ourselves as objective, quote unquote, objective scholars, the way we talk to our narrator, okay, can be strongly, or will be strongly influenced by the cultural context. It depends on the type of person you're interviewing, the age, okay, where the person comes from. Some people, they are high context individuals. So you have to give more meaning to how they behave than what they're saying, because they don't they don't really say what they mean. They're very careful with their words. So you watch what they do, okay, to understand what they're actually saying. Okay, well, there are also low context individuals, and these are, we usually associate them with Westerners. Not all Westerners are low context individuals, but there are individuals who say what they mean and they mean what they say. They're straight to the point. A yes is a yes, a no is a no. So thus, you can rely solely on the words, and you're guaranteed that the words mean exactly, okay, what they are supposed to mean. So those are examples of cultural contexts. While we try to be objective and scientific in our approach, sometimes we can't avoid using sir, ma'am, diba, kuya, ate, tito, tita, lolo, lola, because well, especially the terms of endearment, these somehow make your narrator feel a bit more comfortable. And when their narrators are more comfortable, then they are more open in the interview. Now, the next one is interdisciplinarity. Well, again, so while historians are trained to specialize in the historical method, it's time for us, okay, to really be open to the other techniques of the allied disciplines. So in the humanities and the social sciences, there's so many techniques that we can adopt to enhance the quality of our historical research, including oral histories. And lastly, the digital revolution is altering the landscape. So even in oral history, like I said, if before transcription was essential, these days, okay, it's not only me, but there are other oral historians who are of the belief that transcriptions may not be anymore necessary. Transcriptions are very useful, okay, for researchers of this generation. They're more useful, okay, they're more convenient than watching the actual interviews. But we have to recognize that the next generation are digital natives, and they may prefer, okay, to watch the actual interview than to read, okay, what the narrator said on a sheet of paper. So those are things to consider. The digital revolution has altered the landscape, and there are certain things that we ourselves, being products of an earlier time, okay, we're not all that old, okay, but being products of a different era, having seen this transition, there are certain details that we may not recognize yet. Okay, so we just have to be open-minded about change. Now, just very quickly, since I hope you have questions, the digital archives have become very important in historical research, especially during this time of pandemic. So historical records are now being digitized. So from the parchment, okay, from ancient paper, they're now being transformed into digital format. These days, government and business, even private individuals, are not using as much paper as before. So the traditional historical documents that would be kept in archives and libraries do not anymore exist, because these records are now, well, in native digital or digital native form. Is that the correct way to say it? They were born in digital form, in other words. Letters are not sent on paper, they're now sent as emails. Reports are now sent as PDF files. They're not even printed, okay, etc., etc. So I think you know what I mean. And so some historians have referred to such facts as electronic facts. Okay, so you don't find them in archives and libraries anymore. You will have to know your way through cyberspace, okay, or the digital space in order to retrieve them. Now, a big difference is that in repositories of historical information, archivists and librarians always played an important role. So historians have always had an important relationship with archivists and librarians, because it is the archivists and librarians who would, classify and organize the materials that historians would use. So we know of the logic, okay, but they're the ones who give the logic to all these historical materials. In the digital environment, there are no archivists and librarians. So part of the task is to familiarize oneself with how um, how such information is now being stored and distributed online. Thus, the importance of digital literacy. So while we associate historians with old books and dusty, libraries and dusty places, we have to update our methods to involve knowledge of basic algorithms. Okay, we need to develop basic algorithmic fluency. We need to develop data fluency. It's important to know how to ask the right questions. In many digital archives, they have search engines, but using you have to know how to what words to put in the search engine to get the information you need. Sometimes when you capitalize a certain letter, okay, the related materials do not appear anymore. So for example, in one instance in a digital archive, I typed Carabao with a capital C and I got a few results. But when I tried typing Carabao with a small c, then suddenly I saw the results drastically increase. So such small details can actually affect, okay, or influence the amount of information we will discover. So asking the right questions, knowing how to copy, record, how to store such information, how to reference such information, that's very important. Now I'm running out of time, but finding fakes, you have to know the distinction between what is real and what is fake. You've probably encountered deep fakes. There's technology now that can actually superimpose a person's face, a person's voice, okay, on another recording, on another photograph, on another video. So you can find somebody from 100 years ago suddenly alive, just 20 years ago. So, but not because they really were alive, but mainly because somebody just played with the different materials and put them together and made it appear that the person was alive. So deep fakes, fake news, okay, these are all part of our reality that we also have to be prepared for. And I just want to share some digital repositories. I will share my material with my counterparts in MSU. Okay, so for those in MSU, I will rest assured you will get a copy of this. But here are some digital repositories in the Philippines. So the National Library has some material. The National Archives, the Miguel Benavides Library of UST has an impressive collection, a digital collection. UP, okay, has the same. DLSU will eventually share its oral history collection. At the moment, there are just some internal matters that are being addressed, but much of the collection has been digitized, and hopefully in time, it will be accessible to the public. A very important resource is the archives of the University of Michigan. So in your search engine, just type in UMich Philamer, and you will be directed to this digital archive. And there's information not only on the American period, but also on the earlier era, the late Spanish era. When I was in Michigan, I tried to have a glimpse of some of those materials that have been digitized, and I was told that the digitized materials are already in storage. They are kept in climate controlled rooms, so it's not easy to retrieve. I had to wait 5 days. But basically the attitude was, it's there online, so why the need to see the actual document? Okay, so but again, the historian with this constant state of doubt wants to see the real thing. But basically the point is, the archivists and librarians of Michigan thought that it wasn't really necessary anymore. There is a digital archives in the University of Hawaii, etc., etc. Just type in digital archives in your search engine and you will find them. So I'd like to end my presentation here. Here's my email address. If you have any questions and concerns that I will not be able to address today, please feel free to send me an email. So it's now time for the open forum. So Ms. Serino, are you asking a question? I see a raised hand. So hindi yata. Okay. Anyway, so let me check the Q&A box. So there's a question here on what are the best ways to change our history, and how can we rewrite the story of the Southeast Asian people? Well, as Professor Noor discussed yesterday, what is really necessary is that we adopt a Southeast Asian mindset. We have to recognize that much of our perception of ourselves based on history is based on how Westerners also perceived us. So the early materials on Southeast Asia were reproduced, okay, across time by several individuals, and these have become like the standard knowledge of the region, okay, and including its history. So it is necessary for us to recognize, okay, the limitations of such documents, and to view our past, okay, from our own perspective. So that's really the starting point of rewriting the story of the Southeast Asian people. We must write it from our own point of view, which is something I'm sure you've heard, okay, many times over the years, but which unfortunately has not yet been fully accomplished. Okay, so that was from an anonymous attendee. And well, there's a question on the soft copy of the presentation. Like I said, I will give a soft copy to the organizers from MSU. From Anifa Alonto, do you believe that there is a standing challenge to historians of today to adopt new media in order to engage the younger generation and to make history relevant and interesting to them? Well, definitely. It's not only historians, all scholars, okay, must adapt to the changing times. Perhaps history being one of the oldest disciplines, okay, one of the earliest disciplines, tends to be conservative because we have tried and tested methods and techniques. But like I said, personally, I do believe that historians of today must, okay, adopt the new media, the new technologies, and even, you know, if there are new approaches to make it more interesting and relevant. So, yeah. The next one is from Raymond Tan. I have two questions. Are questions always positive queries? I can imagine cases where the line of questioning can be directed at refuting rather than confirming a hypothesis. Okay. And second, how do you envision social media as being a resource or archive for future historians? Okay. Now, to address the first question on, are questions always positive queries? Well, not always. It depends on the circumstances. So it's the circumstances that dictate. So there are instances when you ask questions to gather information purely, okay, and then there are instances when you engage in oral history to confirm, okay, what is already known, okay. But then there are also instances that require one to refute, because there have been such instances in history where different participants to historical events have contradicted each other, and thus the need, okay, to clarify whose narrative is closer to the truth, quote unquote truth, or if those narratives, though contradictory, are both true, which can be which can happen as well. So to answer the question directly, not all questions are positive queries. Okay, there's a wide range of questions. And on the second question, how do you envision social media as being a resource or archive for future historians? Well, I think it's a given that future historians will accept, okay, social media and the online archives as credible sources of information. I know of some individuals who, prior to the pandemic, were very closed-minded about digital archives, okay, because part of the experience of being a historian is, touching the parchment, smelling the age of the paper, that's part of the experience, because we are also trained to determine the authenticity of documents based on the looks, the feel, the smell, okay, and other visual characteristics. That's part of the training. But when you see it as in digitized form, then you just rely on usually a black and white image, which can easily be a fake. So you have to depend on literary deconstruction to determine authenticity and other techniques. But some aspects are lost. But during the pandemic, some of the individuals I mentioned changed their mind. Perhaps they just never tried it before, okay? Or perhaps they just realized that we have no choice. The archives are closed, the libraries are closed, so we have to engage in historical research. So there is a greater dependence now, okay, on online resources. Now, social media, of course, cannot be just accepted hook, line, and sinker. And the bottom line is whatever information is gathered from social media will have to go through the internal and external criticism of historians. Well, we have a question from Dr. Rohane. I think she's raising her hand. Do you have a question, Dr. Rohane?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I was about to write it on the question and answer. I think I was losing already time, but anyway, this is my question. You were actually saying a while ago that in the conduct of an oral interview, we have to check on the way we ask the so-called informant what they do, and if they really mean what they are saying. Because I don't know what's your take on this. In one oral interview we have conducted, the narrator or the informant refused, due to cultural or religious belief, refused to have a face-to-face or an eye-to-eye contact with us. And it may sound or it may look like very weird, but during the interview, a curtain or some sort of a barricade separates us. And during the start of the interview, there really was no an eye-to-eye contact until we depart from each other. There really was no face-to-face. So I don't know what's your take on this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, ma'am. So, like I said earlier, the cultural consideration is very important. If that is the preference of the narrator, then it has to be respected. Because reading through a person's behavior can also be dangerous. While on one hand, it can give you a better appreciation of what is meant. On the other hand, it can also mislead you because it depends also on your own standards. So some people would say if a person can't look at you, eye to eye, you can't trust him. I think in the West, that is a standard. You have to look a person, okay, eye to eye to be considered trustworthy. But in Asia, people tend to, not look straight at each other's faces. In some cultures, that would even be considered impolite, depending on the context. So that cultural sensitivity is certainly a factor to consider, but I would not use it. I mean, the instance you mentioned of the person requesting for his or her face not to be seen, I would not use it as a basis to judge the credibility of what is being said. Like I said, whatever would be or was stated can always be corroborated, or at least you should try to corroborate them with other sources. Okay, so it's 12:03, unfortunately, and I think I can accommodate only one last question. So again, for the others, if your questions are really very important to you, please send them to me by email, and I'll be very happy to respond. Now, we have a question from Dr. Agnes Brazal. Okay, so thanks for the very informative lecture. Can you clarify the difference between oral history and ethnography, especially if the topic is on a recent past event? Well, actually, the line between oral history and ethnography in this point would be very thin. Okay, except that the main difference with oral history and ethnography is that in ethnography, the identity of the participant need not always be divulged. Okay, in oral history, it is essential, okay, to share who is sharing or who is giving the narrative. So we don't keep the identities secret. Okay, but otherwise, everything else, like I said, there would be a very, very thin line. Perhaps one can also consider that in oral history, the questions tend to revolve around, details that are of historical relevance. Okay, and the other aspects that may be necessary in ethnography to better understand, okay, the person being interviewed, would depend on other sources instead, and not necessarily the interview. Okay, so but again, there's really a very, very thin line. So it's 12:05, and again, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this lecture. So thank you very much for listening, and we will resume this webinar at 1:30 with the lecture on a very interesting lecture on research methods in interfaith studies by Dr. Fides A. del Castillo, and to be followed by the last session of the webinar, which is Getting Published on Top Academic Journals by Dr. Jeremiah Hovenby Joaquin. Okay, so we shall have a break until 1:30. Thank you very much and see you later.